2, 3, 4.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Power of Music Thinking. My name is Christoph Zürn, and this is the podcast for people with a musical heart and a wicked job. We're looking for stories, insights and tools from the big world of music to inspire leaders and followers to listen, tune, play and perform in whatever field you're operating. What can people and organizations learn from science and music? Why should we care? Are there universal mechanisms that are valid all over the world to all human species? Or is everything an individual experience? Today we talk with Hauke Egermann, Professor of Systematical Musicology at the University of Cologne. We speak about universal mechanisms that are valid all over the world. We learn from research with an isolated culture in Congo, the Pygmies from Mebenzélé, that refuse to practice negative music. And they have different songs to regulate their emotions. Songs against fear, anger, or, among others, music to protect hunters in the rainforest. How do they respond to music they have never heard or connected with? What does it evoke? And how does this relate to, for example, Canadian Indigenous people and the listening patterns in the Western world? And Hauke also shares the Music Date concert with us, where the audience emotional reaction is tracked in the first, let's say, the tutti part of the concert, to then separate and assign them to 8 different mini-concerts around one emotion based on their responsives.
Have fun! Again!
All right.
Welcome, Hauke. Welcome to the Power of Music Thinking.
Hello, thank you very much for having me.
What was your first or maybe most memorable sonic experience that had an impact on you? And it could also be an album or performance.
Well, that's a good question. I'm not so sure whether it's just one experience. I guess it's
take your time. You can also share different experiences.
I would say my journey into becoming a music researcher started, of course, with making music on my own, and for a long time, I've been a choir chorister, a choir singer, and I would say very early on, I had very strong experiences with singing together with other people and being part of that sort of a large sound that you form together and that involves you and that's around you. I think this could be something I would say. And that's not specifically like a particular piece of music or a situation. It's just being there and really realizing that sound together with other people. That had quite an impact on me, I would say.
Wow. And it's also that singing together is also listening together. So it's not only about the singing, it's also about the doing. But when did you first sing in a choir?
I would. I don't even remember that specific. I think I was in a children's choir very early on, probably in primary school time. Then I joined sort of a church choir in Germany that's called Kantorei when I was in my teenage years. And then when I was 16, I went to a boarding school that specialized in music, and I joined the Rundfunk-Jugendchor Wernigerode, which is sort of a, you can say, a broadcast youth choir that did several productions with sort of the regional radio station and television station there. And that was, quite an intense and important experience for me to be part of that choir for a couple of years.
I even can imagine the difference singing, let's say, in a classroom together or in a church. So the sound then becomes much more one.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we basically sang every day, everywhere, all the time. There were like several rehearsals across the week, and we also performed, I would say, at least once a month or every 2 months or so. But I think what was really impressive for me there was the experience to work together and focus and achieve something together, and sort of to experience this idea that you immerse yourself into something really, really deeply, and then you become really, really good at it, and you do that together with other people, and then all of a sudden you create this massive sound. And we participated in some competitions at that time, and then we were sort of the best German youth choir for several years in a row, which was, of course, very rewarding.
Wow. Hauke, can you introduce yourself briefly? What do you do for a living, and then we can segue into different themes.
Yes, so my name is Hauke Egermann, and I am a professor for systematic musicology at the University of Cologne in Germany. And so I did not become a singer or a professional choir singer, even though for some time early on I was quite interested in that. But I was really initially interested in how music can be linked to technology, and how music can be studied from a more scientific perspective, I would say. And this is why I started many, many years ago studying systematic musicology, and that sort of paved the path for everything that followed. And now I teach the same subject at the University in Cologne.
So I can assume that some people have an idea what musicology is, and some people not. Maybe can you explain what is then systematic musicology? What's the difference to, and are there other ways of musicology?
Exactly. So I think people from with a sort of a Anglo-American English-speaking background might not be familiar with that concept. When they hear the word musicology, they think of people that write about, I think traditionally, composers and their work. They analyze that. They analyze the lives of composers, the social context of that, and they do that from I would say, a methodology that comes from the humanities. In Germany, we had an influential musicologist in the 19th century who thought about the different ways that music could be researched, and he proposed that there could be two ways of splitting. There could be two parts of musicology, two ways that could be split up. There could be a part of musicology that looks into sort of the artwork itself, and that has that as a focus, and the artist behind that. This is what we would consider historical musicology. But then he also suggested, his name was Guido Adler, and he suggested that there could be also a kind of music research that not only looks into individual artifacts, but that tries to unify them in a way and to look for similarities across them. And he suggested that one could look for laws, Gesetzmäßigkeiten, that guide music as an art, I would say. And this, of course, is a bit limited in a way that I do not believe that there are laws, like natural laws, on how to compose music. and achieve certain effects in listeners, for example, or make something more beautiful. But this was the belief that people had in the 19th century. That was also the time when experimental psychology was established as a discipline, and empirical aesthetics were also conceived, and where people tried to do experiments and find out, what do people like, what do they enjoy, are there certain proportions that are universally more pleasurable, for example, than others, so this is how all this came about, and this is why we still have that tradition in Germany that we divide musicology and into different subdisciplines. And there's a more traditional, historically oriented one, but then there's the systematic musicology, which is still around. And I would describe this as musicology that uses methods that come from the natural and the social sciences. And I think in other countries, people would call this music and science, or the science of music. But I must also admit, there are also, of course, other fields in musicology. Of course, there's ethnomusicology, which has been established as a new discipline over the last century. We have popular music studies, cultural studies. So this has been quite diverse, so to speak. And I'm within that framework. This is where I do my research.
Absolutely. That sounds a lot with what we're doing at the Power of Music Thinking. So looking for patterns. You didn't say the word patterns, but it sounded very much instead of laws, because laws would say, okay, first we make the law, and then we see how people behave together or against the law, and finding patterns in fields that we not have expected. That's also nice research. Can you share one of your researches so that people have an idea from, that's what he's doing? Because the first part of the historical, we can imagine there's a composer and we want to know everything about the composer and how it's perceived and everything. But maybe good to have an example and to see how this also reaches us as humans, because we all have two ears and listen all day instead, as long as we don't put the fingers in our ear or use a headphone.
Yeah, of course. I can happily do that. So we can say that within systematic musicology, we start, of course, with when we do a research, the first thing someone would need to consider is the acoustic reality. So musical acoustics would be the sort of the starting ground for any kind of research. And it's not that this is really my specialization, but there are other colleagues that study that. And then based on that, you would have psychoacoustics and research that looks into the perception of musical sounds and musical forms, so to speak, and the cognitive processing of these. And I'm thinking of this as now sort of a kind of a hierarchy. So you start at the very bottom, which is lowest is the sort of the physical realm, the acoustical realm, and on top of that, you're building sort of the different levels of processing that happens, sort of music and processing that happens in our body. So we have psychoacoustics, and then we have perception of musical attributes such as timbre or pitch. And based on that, we have the cognitive processing, sort of memory of music, memory for melodies, encoding, decoding. And then based on that, we have research that looks into the aesthetic and emotional effects of that. So when all this happens in us, in our body, what does it do to us? Why do we enjoy it? Why do we engage in it so much? You could look at that, these different levels, of course, from a music listening perspective, but you can also look into music performance. So there's a lot of research that we do in our discipline that looks into performers, how they perceive music, how they interact with each other, how they feel emotionally. For example, there's a lot of research into performance anxiety. But my personal emphasis in this entire context is that I'm really intrigued by, well, let's say, the power of music and the effects that it has on us, sort of on a more emotional level, but also on a social level. So what does music do to us when we listen to it, and where does this come about? Where does it come from? And what are the underlying mechanisms, processes, and you can call them patterns. I prefer the idea of sort of a mechanism, even though we're not machines, right? But nevertheless, this is a way that within cognitive science, people think of how different things are related to each other. And these relationships, they can be studied, they can be modeled statistically. And we're not talking about deterministic models in a way that we can say when A happens, always B happens. This would be a sort of a natural law. So when I use this chord sequence, everyone will always experience that specific feeling. No, this is not how it works. We will in our research we will identify various underlying variables that we think are relevant, and they lie in the listener, or herself. They lie, of course, in the music, but they will also lie in the context, right? So all these three things, they always come together, and then they influence an outcome, which could be a subjective experience, but it could be also a bodily response, or it could be a movement that we experience in someone. And then we determine sort of the probabilistic relationships amongst these factors.
Okay.
And I can give you now an example. I said that I'm interested in the effects of music, and one thing I'm really interested in is to which degree these effects are based on things that we have learned throughout our enculturation. Starting with our childhood, we're born into a culture, and we basically learn to associate musical parameters with meaning and emotional effects. But there could be also some effects of music and sound that are universal, right? They're genetically predetermined. They're imprinted, so to speak, in a way into our body and through our genes. And if we want to study, if we want to look for these things, we need to look for two different populations of music listeners who have never been in contact with each other and their respective culture.
Right. So listening to it for the first time without any connection, without any pre-information.
Exactly. So you basically need to find someone who's never listened to the type of music that you're interested in, or not even that specific recording or piece, but that entire genre of music. And if you compare that person's response to someone who has not, who's very familiar to that music, and if you then see some similarities between these two, we could conclude that these similarities are realized to some kind of shared genetic predisposition.
Okay. Wow. And you did a research like this.
Exactly. So
in Africa, right?
Exactly. So it's a bit difficult to find these kind of two groups of people in one country. It's impossible. And we also have now, of course, sort of a Western music across the globe, and so music becomes globalized, and people travel across. We have digital music streaming services, so it's basically impossible nowadays to find people who have never really been in context with each other's culture. However, a couple of years ago, I was quite lucky because my supervisor at that time established a collaboration with an ethnomusicologist and her name was Natalie Fernando, and she was an expert in a population of Pygmies that live in the Congo and that are really, really isolated from most of the, at least Western cultural influences. And she's been traveling to that community for many years on a regular basis and done sort of more qualitative ethnographic research, trying to understand their music, their culture. And one observation that she made was that, to her surprise, they were, music is, of course, like a big part of their culture, like it is in most cultures. So there's a lot of singing and drumming going on. And what was interesting about that population of Mebenzélé Pygmies it was that they used music quite a lot for emotion regulation. And that means that they had songs against different emotions. They had songs against fear, sang songs against anger, songs for very specific situations that we could consider emotional. And then
that's interesting. Just to interrupt. That's interesting because I can imagine that when some people listen now to what you just explained, that this is, let's say, a mechanism that people nowadays also use. So if they go to some place, they maybe try to say, okay, I have to be in a certain in a certain emotion. So I'm listening, let's say, some kind of music, so that makes me happy or that makes me strong. Or maybe if you would like to have sad music, if you if you are already sad, to live also that music a little bit more. So is this a mechanism that's the same, but with different kind of music, I assume?
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of research into sort of Western cultures and music traditions, and what you basically described is basically a common phenomenon. So I would say when you look into the reasons why people listen to music, if you ask them that, there's lots of studies on that and surveys, and the main goal is to regulate emotions and arousal, to take you into a right mood that is desired for you. One thing that was quite interesting, though, in this comparative research is that in the Western world, we have music basically for all types of emotions, and people, that there, we could say, this is a very simplified model to think about emotions. We can say there are about 5 basic emotions. You have happiness, you have anger, you've got fear, you've got sadness, surprise and disgust, actually 6. And happiness is, so to speak, the only positive emotion. But then in the Western world, so there's of course music that makes you happy. There's music in the Western world that makes you sad, and music that maybe also makes you angry. And there are people that enjoy these respective experiences. And we do need to distinguish between the expressive quality of music and the felt and induced quality of music. So, of course, there's a difference to what music expresses compared to what you experience on your own. So I could, let's say, listen to a sad piece of music that expresses sadness, but I could enjoy that, and it could be a pleasant experience, even though I'm also sad at the same time.
I think many people, I think that resonates with many people, that sometimes you have a song and later you realize, oh, that's there's a story behind it. I had this, I think with Mahler, which I like certain parts that are very slow moving, and they don't make me sad at all. They make me, let's say, maybe calm, but later you think, oh, it's a completely different context. So and I can imagine that people experience this in completely different ways. So that would not be the universal part.
Exactly. And this is something that we only found, or that, so as far as I know, that's really common for sort of our Western music tradition. When Natalie Fernando, when she interviewed the Pygmy participants, or these informants there in her study, they refused the idea to express and listen to music that has any form of negativity in it. So there
Oh.
was, in their culture, music was only there to get you from a negative state into a positive state. And for that, it had to be positive, right? So there were
Oh.
different songs, different types of music for different negative emotions that were then supposed to be resolved into something that's more positive.
Oh, so there's always an upswing in their kind of that's not musical taste, that's musical culture.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. This was the reason why she said, well, that's really interesting. And why don't we do an experiment on them and measure how they respond to their own music, but maybe also how they respond to Western music. And then we got together and we designed an experiment. And afterwards, she then traveled into the Congo, and it's quite a journey. So you basically, if you want to get to that community that live in a little village in the rainforest, it's very as there's no road going there. So you basically have to get onto a boat, a canoe for 5 hours in order to reach that place. And so this is also why these people are quite isolated, because it's really remote.
Yeah.
And they do not use electricity. So there's no power plug. They don't even have batteries and radios. So this is why they live a sort of very, I don't know if you want to call it that way, but a very traditional life. But I think nowadays people don't call it like that. But it's very, let's say, separate to the rest of the world around them. They would sometimes travel to a market and sell the products. And they might then be in contact with sort of African sort of mainstream culture. But most of the time they stay within their community and the rainforest. And so this is why we can be for sure that they've never been exposed to Western European, well, let's say from music sort of, or Western art music, let's put it that way. So
how did they react to your colleague? So I can imagine if then she goes there, she comes there. How does this work? So if you say they go to the market, okay, I would say that's would be a natural way to get introduced into each other. I don't know if introduce is the right word.
Yeah.
But if she's traveling there, wouldn't they think, what is she doing? Or hard to imagine for me.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, well, she's been there multiple times. They will know her. She has a relationship established with them. And I think generally, I mean, I've just seen photos and video recordings of that, and her descriptions. I guess they're just generally very interested. I mean, you can see they're all surrounding her. And I must admit, I mean, she paid them also to participate in these studies. I guess they can use that money when they then travel and go, I don't know, buy some food or clothes or whatever. But well, she basically then went there, spent a month with that in that village, and recruited about 40 participants, and they all volunteered to listen to her music, the music that she recorded of them, of that population before, and music that we took there that we knew that was, from a Western perspective, expressive of certain emotional qualities. So we played the music that would be considered expressing happiness, music that was expressing anger, and music that was expressing fear, and music that was expressing sadness.
Can you give us examples? So that we have, what kind of music was it? Was it classical music? Was it pop, rock, heavy metal?
So one group of stimuli came from a collection that was done, that was put together by a colleague, Emmanuel Bigon, in the I think early 2000s. It was uh, uh, orchestral music from the late 19th and the late 18th and early 19th century, like Brahms, Beethoven, things like that. And these are music excerpts, right? So they're like about 30 seconds long. Then we also added a piece of music from the soundtrack of Star Wars, the Cantina scene. It's a sort of a Dixieland sound. Then we had an example from Hitchcock, Psycho soundtrack, the film, which is sort of very high-pitched strings going up. That was sort of supposed to express...
theremin, isn't it?
There are some violence.
Yeah. You know the electronic instrument theremin? I think that's
I know that.
Or mixto tratonium. So it's still electric. But it sounds like strings if you don't know the instrument. That's pretty right.
Okay, but it's just very high pitched and drops down and sort of expresses sort of this anger, fear, like negative emotion with high arousal level. And then I don't really remember this. I'm afraid I would need to look it up. Then we had something that was also sad. But this is instrumental music. It was specifically chosen to sort of cover a wide range of different emotional qualities.
And you say it was instrumental.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. Because sometimes in other podcast episodes, sometimes we come to the same thing, like that people say, "Oh, I like that song. I didn't understood the words, but I loved everything about the words." And later you understand that this song is going about something completely different. So that's also, I would say, a common pattern. For example, in Europe we had, I think in the 80s, it was "Vamos a la Playa." That was a summer hit all over Europe, but it was about dropping the atom bomb, and that's why the people should go to the beach. So that was really funny to see the sound. So, but because you are mentioned that you are playing in a choir, which is also most of it songs and words, but the sounds that they heard were, let's say, abstract sounds, more or less, from without any words. And
yeah, well, I wouldn't call them just sounds. I would say this is music, right? Because they're in a way organized.
No offense here.
But of course, I find it, to be honest, I find it very difficult to deal with the issue of lyrics and semantics, and this is why I've sort of, throughout all my research so far, I've sort of navigated myself around that. Of course, it plays a big part. But I usually say I'm a musicologist. I do music research, so I'm not I'm not interested in literature or poems, poetics, and so therefore I'm just like ignoring all these other additional levels of meaning, and that could also have an effect there.
But one question in between, sorry, Hauke, because it just pops up in my mind. Because you mentioned before that the Pygmies, that they have songs to regulate their emotions, and that there were positive songs. So my question would be, were these songs sung, or was it also some kind of instrumental music?
Yeah. That's the thing. So this is a sort of what we would consider a limitation of that study. So the music that was recorded from the Pygmies, this was, of course, vocal, because they don't have any music instruments except drums. But for the Western music, we just used instrumental music. I just pulled up the list of stimuli. So I think I could just read this. For the Pygmy music, we had a lullaby. We had music to calm anger. We had a music that was sort of considered religious for their spirit. We had a music to entertain, music against fear, music for funerals, music against sadness, and music for protecting of man hunting in the forest. So this is how these pieces were described.
Wow.
And so they also have different sort of emotional qualities, but generally their goal is to bring them into a positive state. Maybe with different degrees of arousal. And we then played them these excerpts. We played them the Western excerpts, and we asked them to continuously rate their experience of valence and arousal. So they had a little iPod Touch interface. So that was something that was around before smartphones, but it looks a bit like a smartphone. So the touch interface that had what we call the two-dimensional valence arousal space on it. If you put your finger into the top right corner, it means that what you're experiencing is pleasant and arousing. If you move your finger down to the bottom right corner, it means that it's pleasant and calming. If you move your finger to the left side, it means it's negative, and in the left bottom corner, it's negative and unpleasant and calming. And the top left corner, it means it's stimulating and negative. So we have valence from positive to negative on the horizontal axis, and arousal from top to bottom. From at the top it's high, and at the bottom it's low. And they did that throughout listening to the piece. So we asked them, please show us how the music makes you feel while you listen to it. And we also measured their respiration rate, their skin conductance, and their heart rate. And these are all indicators of sympathetic arousal. So when we talk about emotions, we think of them that are manifested not only on the subjective level, but also on the bodily level. Because emotions are always about doing something generally. They're about a motivation to act, to engage in some kind of fight or flight response, a freezing response. So these are sort of from an evolutionary perspective, that's a function of emotion, emoting. And therefore, there are these bodily components. Your body prepares for a certain action when you react emotionally. This is why we measure skin conductance, for example, and heart rate and respiration. We also measured their facial expressions, which is another emotion component, because when we experience an emotion, we tend to communicate that to people around us as well. And we do that by measuring the activity of two facial muscles, smiling and frowning. It's a corrugator for frowning and the zygomaticus major for smiling. However, I can just say that didn't work in the jungle, in the rainforest, because it was way too hot, and the electrodes keep falling off, and so we couldn't use these recordings anymore. But we could measure skin conductance and heart rate and respiration, and we did then the same experiment afterwards in Canada at McGill University, where we were based at that time. And we also recruited participants that were as similar as possible to the Pygmy participants. And basically, the idea was to basically replicate the entire procedure, everything as it was in the initial study. And that allows us now to do a cross-cultural comparison. So we have music from two different cultures that has been listened to, and that's been played to two participants from two different cultures. And now we can observe look at the effects of these different pieces, different excerpts. And the first surprising finding was that we did find some similarities. Like in the beginning, I think a lot of people would have thought, well, these are people from a very, very different cultural background. They've never heard the Western music. So they were asked about that. Have you ever heard this kind of music? No. Not a single participant said, yeah, I think I once went to cinema somewhere and there was an orchestra playing it back. No, it didn't happen before. And of course, the Western participants have never been in touch with Pygmy music before. And so we could see that the music was of the other culture was very unfamiliar. However, the music from their own cultures, the Western music, sounded quite familiar to Western listeners. The Pygmy music sounded quite familiar to the Pygmy listeners. And we could also see that from their perspective, these different pieces had different effects and quality. So the Western music covered quite a wide range in the emotion space, as we would have suggested in the two-dimensional model. So there was music that, from a Western perspective, from the Western business, was calming and positive, and a bit, some negative pieces. And from the Pygmies perspective, their music on them was mostly centered around the top right corner of that space. So the music that is pleasant and arousing. And some pieces were a little bit more arousing, some were a little bit less, some was a little bit more positive. But we generally have that sort of that area here. What we then did, we tried to take these ratings of the emotional effect as predictors in a regression model. Now it becomes, I'm sorry, very statistical. We're trying to use that information about every piece of music in order to predict the effect it has on both groups, on the subjective, but also the physiological level.
So that means what it does with their body.
Yeah. And so we could say, well, we could that way look for similarities in the two groups. And the conclusion was here that music that was arousing to Western listeners was also more arousing to the Pygmies, and led to higher skin conductance and higher heart rate measures and respiration measures in both groups. So we observed a similarity here across the arousal dimensions.
Okay.
However, we did not find any similarity when it came to the valence of the experience, so whether it was positive or negative. And
okay.
So the conclusion was that the arousal response to music is based on universal mechanisms, whereas the valence response, whether it's positive, negative, pleasant, unpleasant, that seems to be strongly based on things that relate to learning. We also then went a bit deeper and did an acoustical analysis of the music. And we could then show that, for example, the tempo, spectrocentroid, and pitch, these effects had very similar, or these characteristics of the sounds of the music, because every piece of music has sound qualities, right? They led to very similar responses in both groups. Okay. So we believe that these similarities were driven by the fact that some pieces simply had higher average pitch, higher, brighter sounds in them, and also faster tempi.
Yeah. I can imagine that tempo is something, because we as a person, we have a heartbeat, and I think it's around 60 beat per minute. And when we walk, I think it's around 80, 90 beat per minute. So there must be something in our body, literally, that gives us some kind of beat. And I can imagine that this relates to if they hear a beat in music. That would be a question for a researcher, but interesting. So, but you said this would be universal.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow.
This is the conclusion, that to a certain degree, basically, if you play people music that's loud, that's fast, that has higher pitches across the world, they will be more likely to experience an sort of more bodily activation and also subjective arousal. But the question of whether you like something, whether it's pleasant or not, that is completely based on what you associate with that, what meaning it has for you. And there, I would need to go to other areas. It becomes more social in a way, right? So we're into social psychology there.
Nice. Thank you for sharing this one. Maybe cool to segue into another project that I heard about, and that is in some way absolutely connected, the music date. Can you elaborate a little bit on this? Because I assume that the universals that we just heard, they are also valence in a Western culture.
Yeah, so that was a project that was done in collaboration with an orchestra here in Hanover, the Orchestra im Treppenhaus, and they have very let's say innovative approach to presenting classical music in new different forms and ways. And one idea that they developed, I must admit, I'm not really part of that sort of, I haven't had any input into that original idea, but the idea was that they would design a concert that allows you to use a dating app, so to speak, where you can say, I like that specific piece or that specific section of a piece of music, and I want to hear more of that in the future. And so they developed this concert where there are two parts, and in the beginning, you listen to the first part, then have this dating app where you say, well, I like this, or you don't like it, so you can basically press a button. And then the second half, you would then get the option to choose between 12 different versions, I think, of the second half of the concert that are played in small groups. And here, the app basically gives you a recommendation on which music fits best to what you've said before, like what you liked. And so this is all based on the idea that music expresses certain emotions, and these emotions could be enjoyable to us, and you would then be aligned to one of the emotions that you preferred most during the first piece of the concert. And my role was only there that we then did a little study on sort of evaluating the overall concert design. So we did a survey of participants there. We also tried to do a little bit some analysis on the data that was collected during the concert. People basically pressing a button when they said I liked something, or unfortunately we couldn't use that because we couldn't synchronize it to the music. So, but I think I'd like to talk a little bit about the expressivity of music, and that also links to what I've spoken about before in the Pygmies study. And if you like, we could listen to the music excerpts that I sent to you. And maybe we'll just listen first, and then I'll talk about it.
Have fun. Again.
All right.
Is there something that you noticed that sort of is some sort of similarity here between these two files? Maybe we'll listen to the sad examples now. So sad music and sad body sounds.
Have fun. Again.
All right.
So I think it becomes quite obvious here that there is some similarity between how music expresses emotions and how we express emotions with our voice and how we express emotions with our body. So these two music pieces, I've just put them together with, of course, pieces, excerpts. So we have for the higher version, the happy version, we have higher pitch, faster tempo, higher loudness. For the sad version, it's lower pitch, lower tempo, and lower loudness. And the recordings from people's voices actually have very similar characteristics. So these were performers that were actors that were instructed to express these words with specifically these two emotions, with happiness and sadness. And we, if we do an acoustic analysis of the voices, we can find that we use very similar acoustical features to express emotions in the voice as we do in the music. The last recording, or the third type of sound we heard, were people walking, and they were also instructed to walk as if they are in a happy or in a sad state. And we did an experiment, or some colleagues of mine did an experiment, and I sort of helped with writing the article about that later on. And they instructed the participants to create these sort of sound recordings that were then analyzed, and we could then see that the acoustical features that are, let's say, some are of the acoustical features that are used to express emotions here are very, very similar in walking, but also in music and also in the voice. And this basically leads us to the conclusion that the expressivity of the music comes from maybe something that could be considered body knowledge. Like, we know how a body moves, how a body expresses emotions. And when you play an instrument, you basically make use of that knowledge. And this is used in the encoding process of a performer, but it's also used in the decoding process of a listener. So it's basically this idea that music sounds a little bit like someone is moving emotionally. And I really, really like this idea, because it helps us to explain and understand a lot of very fundamental musical phenomena, like why music is maybe so emotionally touching to us, because it really, really expresses emotions like a person would do, right?
Right.
So you hear someone crying, and it's our most intuitive and also presumably innate response to go and help that person. So when a piece of music sounds like someone is crying and experiencing deep sadness, we feel a strong connection to that. So these are presumably mechanisms that have a very deep evolutionary foundation in our ability to communicate our states, but also to respond to them. And these are processes that could be called emotional contagion or empathy. So you empathize with someone, your ability to empathize with someone and feel how they feel, to take their perspective, that's something that's very deeply ingrained into also our experience of music. And the interesting thing about music then is it's not really a person, right? It is something abstract. It's a piece of art. It's an idea that can then be so much more than what a person can express, right? If you look into a voice, the range of pitch of a voice, of course, is limited, but the range of pitch of an instrument is much wider, and therefore it's presumably much more expressive. And you think of not only one instrument, if you think of an entire orchestra, right? The different dynamic ranges that it can take. So these very simple acoustical features have very, very strong emotional effects on us, therefore.
I like that very much, because that's also something that we maybe should focus more on. And there's also a saying, music is like touching from a distance, which what you just explained literally is. And and that's also the switch that I often try to make. So why should we talk about music? Why should we talk about the power of music thinking? What can I do with it? And I think there are many ideas where music, and also the knowledge of music, and also, as you call it, mechanisms of music, could help us to first better understand and then do something with it, or what you just said with the coding and decoding. So there is a code in somewhere that I want to do something with it, and you know, or you try that people decode it in a certain way. And 2 episodes back, we had an episode about sonic branding. So that's where brands first try to be themselves and to communicate who they are, just to be also different from other people. Same what we do with our voices. Every voice is completely different. So I see there's a lot of learning explicitly, but also implicitly for I would say for the rest of the world. So when we look from the music perspective. Hauke, is there anything that we didn't touch in our talk today?
Well, I think there's so many more things. I mean, I've spent quite a lot of time talking about this Pygmy project in the Congo, and there would have been so many more. But maybe if people are interested, of course, they can find out about our research online if they like to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can put this in the show notes, also the link to the Institute, because that would be my last question. What would it need to study systematic musicology, and what would you do? What would or could you do after with it?
Well, that's a good question. So. One thing you can do, you can come to Cologne, to our institute, and enroll in our course in musicology, which I think is very unique. We have a strong emphasis on these types of research that I've spoken about today. What you will get is a training in music, but you will also in music research, but you'll also get a training into statistics and data science in empirical research methods. And these are, of course, transferable skills that you can then apply to other fields. But I would say traditionally, so if you do a degree in our field, of course, you're first of all qualified as a music researcher and musicologist, and so you can pursue an academic career. But many other people would go into culture institutions, the music industry. What I'm really interested in is also the area of music technology and how this can be connected to sort of the more fundamental research that we do. So the question would be, how can we use this knowledge of music, emotional effects, its expressivity, for example, in music recommendation algorithms and streaming platforms? And so, of course, this is an area where we can work in and sort of develop that. So a lot of the research here is done by computer scientists, which is of course great. But I think sometimes sort of having a little bit more musical background knowledge can also be helpful, and designing and developing much more sophisticated and sort of innovative ways of how to interact with music.
Absolutely. Sounds good. And if people have heard this podcast before, they know that I also studied musicology. So, and from my point of view, this was a really, really important thing to see and hear and experience the world much more broader in different ways. And I think your example of the Pygmies in Congo were a pretty good example, and also universal things like that. So thank you very much for the full podcast. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate this, because listening is one of the top leadership skills, and I feel honored about this. It is my mission to find, create, and share inspirations for meaningful collaboration based on music analogies. If you want to support this, please subscribe to the podcast, give us a rating, or write a review on iTunes or Spotify. And more inspirations can be found on musicthinking.com. We have a blog, and you can download the Music Thinking Framework. And finally, I would love to hear your feedback. And if you need help with a business challenge, please reach out to me via email, podcast@musicthinking.com.